Our next session is a panel. We're going to bring on people who are extraordinarily expert and have thought really long and hard about questions to do with the development of skills, the development of a truly creative workforce, both, I think, for the creative industries and more generally the importance of creativity in our wider culture. So I'm delighted to introduce to chair that the former Executive Director of Creative Skillset, as many of you will know her, currently an independent consultant advising a number of organisations and chairing UK animation and various industry bodies, the excellent Kate O'Connor. Kate. And her panel, who she will introduce.
Thank you, Anthony. Hi, everyone. My God, that was a hard one to follow, although we unfortunately missed all of that presentation as we waited to come on. So we are now going to talk about skills, and I am so delighted that we have skills on the agenda today, because it almost goes without saying that skills should be at the heart of any discussion around skills, around research and development. But until quite recently, it actually wasn't at the heart of that. And that, to me, is just a tragedy in the sense that it's not just our creative ability, our technical innovation, but everything hinges on our skilled workforce and all the challenges that sit around developing a skilled workforce as key assets for growth and wealth creation. So the title of this session could almost be, we need to talk about skills, to borrow a title. And we need to talk about what we know, what we don't know, what we, and by we I mean education, industry, policy bodies, industry bodies need to do. And by way of a brief explanation of why I might be sitting in the chair today, earlier in the year I had a privilege actually to have an insight into the current canon of work, and I did some work for the AHRC to find out what we did know about skills in and across our creative industries by reviewing the data. And thanks to a fantastic dynamic classification of our industries, we now have a lot of numbers. We have the spreadsheets, as it were. We know that 1 in 11 new jobs will be in the creative industries. We know that there's been a 5% growth year on year over recent years since we started counting. But what do we know? What do we really know beyond the numbers? What do we know about the roles and the skills that underpin and cut across our creative sectors? How do we know what that means in terms of our regions, our nations, our clusters? What can we say about skills, challenges and combinations, and the marriage of some of these binaries, content and coding, creativity and tech, science and art? Where are we with STEAM or STEAMed or fusion? And how is our education and training system reflecting that? And perhaps more importantly, what does the future hold? How can we forecast accurately? How can we really shape policy and delivery? How can we be strategic and practical in meeting our skill needs? Well, I found plenty of material. There was no shortage of material, over 200 very recent reports. But if I'm honest, and to use a technical term, the research was quite spiky. It was good at a certain level, but didn't really delve down to sector level, certainly not to regional level, and you couldn't look too far ahead. So we have real challenges in terms of data collection about skills, about the intelligence around analysing our greatest asset. But change is ahead, and there are new approaches, new methodologies, newly identified findings, and lots of challenges have been surfaced by many people in this room, but also in particular the people on the panel. So I have great pleasure in introducing our fantastic panel, who will all say a few words, a sort of hybrid panel question session. They'll all say a few words about their research and their views on that issue of what do we know about skills in the creative industries, and then we'll have a conversation about maybe what we can do about it. So our panelists are up up there in lights and need no further introduction. But we're going to kick off with Hasan Bakhshi from Leicester, who, when I looked at 200 reports earlier this year, I think quite a few of them came from your team, Hasan. So prolific is the word I would use. But you're announcing today some even more new research. Over to Hasan.
Thank you, Kate, and good afternoon, everyone. I haven't got the clicker, so I'm actually going to go over, it's okay, Kate,
Fantastic.
over to the...
Yeah, go for it.
Use the laptop. Got a couple of slides to show you, so thanks for your patience in advance. So the first thing to say is I'm really genuinely excited to be speaking in my capacity as Director of the new Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, the PEC, as some of you all know it as. This is we're bringing together a multidisciplinary group of academic researchers right across the UK to build an evidence base to inform policy. This should lead to, to accelerated growth and sustained growth in the creative industries, but also, as Andrew Thompson mentioned earlier on this morning, evidence to help shape the direction of future growth in the creative industries. A number of my PEC colleagues and co-investigators are in the audience and have been at the event all day, and hopefully some of you have had a chance, therefore, to have an early insight into some of our plans. So today we're launching our interim website with the URL here, www.pec.ac.uk. You can see the details of our partners on that website. You can sign up to our newsletter, which will be a way of staying in touch with our early work. And then last but not least, on the website, you can download our first publication that Kate referred to, which is looking at creativity and the future of skills. So in this research, I'm going to say brief words about this research now, but in this research we look at 35 million UK job ads posted online between 2013 and 2017 inclusive to understand the importance of creativity to different occupations in the labour market. Now, as with all data, there are limitations in using online job ads for research purposes, but there are a number of big attractions, and the one I want to highlight here is that job ads are sources of data which employers articulate their need for talent in their own words. So what do we learn from these data? Well, the first thing is that there's a strong demand for creativity in a relatively small number of occupations, but that creativity is barely mentioned in job ads for the vast majority of jobs. So if I give an example that we mentioned in the paper, graphic designers. It turns out that job ads for graphic designers are 20 times more likely to mention the word creativity than medical practitioners, 13 times more likely to mention creativity than management consultants, and just over 4 times more likely to mention creativity than R&D managers. I'm going to show you a chart here. So this chart, which is taken from figure 1 from the report, plots the distribution of creativity in job ads right across occupations, and you can see that this distribution is heavily skewed. So this is the chart on the left-hand side of the image here. And you can see that there are a small number of occupations right on the right-hand side which are accounting for this skewed distribution. Compare that with something like commercial communication skills. That's another transferable skill like creativity, but here you can see that its use is so all-pervasive in job adverts that it's arguably has lost its meaning in the labour market. The requirement for creativity, another way of looking at this, is to look at the DCMS's list of, the official list of creative occupations that are deemed to be creative in the official classifications. It turns out that job ads in those occupations are 4.3 times more likely to say creativity than ads for occupations in the workforce more widely. Now, this is an important finding because it is a direct riposte to those who claim or believe that the language of creativity has become so widespread that it's lost all currency, that it's lost all meaning in the labour market. In the report, we also investigate the relationship between creative occupations and their future growth prospects. And for this, we use predictions from our published research with Pearson on the future of skills. It turns out of the 39 transferable skills, and I'll say a bit about what I mean by transferable skills briefly in a minute, but of the 39 transferable skills that we consider, creativity consistently is the most significant predictor of an occupation's chance of growing its future workforce share. And these are long-term predictions that we looked at in this report. Now you can contrast that with transferable skills like being detailed-oriented, and I'm quoting here from the skills tags that you get from classifying the online job ads. But if you look at transferable skills like being detailed-oriented, having customer service skills, or having basic computer skills, turns out that those transferable skills are significantly negatively correlated with an occupation's future growth prospects. And on reflection, this is intuitive, perhaps not unsurprising given the changing nature of work, and in particular the anticipated effects that widespread automation are going to have on the labour market. In terms of transferable skills, just briefly for those if you're wondering what I mean by that, transferable skills are identified in the database of online job ads because they have the distinguishing characteristic that they connect very different clusters of skills. So they, in network analysis terms, they are central nodes in the network. And so these are transferable skills that are important to connect otherwise disconnected clusters of skills. So another key finding, alongside creativity, it turns out that organisation and management skills are also positively related to an occupation's growth prospects. In fact, and I'll show you my last chart here, Figure 2 here from the report shows that creativity and organisation and management and research skills are strong complements. And what I mean by that is that those occupations that combine both sets of skills, creativity, but also organisation, management and research skills, tend to have particularly rosy prospects. So if you look at this chart here, the x-axis here is a measure of how significant project management and organisational skills and research skills are to an occupation, and the y-axis is a measure of how important creativity is to the occupation. What you want to look at is the mass of occupations in the top right-hand corner. So these are occupations or job ads in occupations which rely on organisational skills, management skills, and creativity. The colours here are blue, or the purple colours there, represent occupations which are predicted to see fast growth in the future, and the green ones are those that are predicted with a high likelihood of seeing weakness in the future. And then the dark boundaries that you can see around some of these blobs is to identify the DCMS list of creative occupations. And what you should see here is the mass is basically of this distribution is towards that top right-hand corner. So occupations which happen to rely on creativity as well as having important organisational management skills or acquiring them are the ones that are the fastest, predicted to grow with fastest, with most confidence in the future, and also the DCMS list disproportionately appear in that list. So, I mean, just reflecting on this, perhaps this is of no surprise to those creative practitioners in the audience who know that to do good creative work, it's typically project-based, often involving bringing diverse teams together from different sources, which requires, of course, strong organisational and management skills. So as I noted earlier, job ads articulate, the big strength in our job ads, as well as being timely, of course, is that they articulate skills needs in employers' own words. So this research is of obvious use for policymakers who are trying to prioritise which skills should be targeted in policies to develop workforce skills. So hopefully that's obvious. Moreover, because we can cluster different occupations based on their skills, we can also make robust quantitative statements about how viable or realistic it is for individuals to retrain from one occupation to another. And because many jobs have salary information too, we can also say something about the returns to such retraining. So the potential, I hope you'll agree, for revolutionising labour market intelligence in areas like reskilling, training, careers advice and so forth, using such data should be obvious. On its own, however, this research says little about the wider barriers to reskilling in the specific context of creative work, and therefore what policy interventions are needed to support reskilling. And this is where a different type of research base is needed. Qualitative research that explores the psychological and emotional, as well as the economic barriers to individuals reskilling, and importantly, what measures can be implemented, effective measures can be implemented to overcome these. And this requires looking at literatures on work psychology, human resource management, organisational science, management science, and so forth. And this, of course, is where the Policy and Evidence Centre I mentioned at the outset will step in, because it's our multidisciplinary mix of quantitative and qualitative research that will develop the policy ideas that are grounded in the best evidence. Lastly, the final strong finding that I wanted to draw your attention to from this new paper today, looking at online job ads, is that the DCMS's creative occupations do not have a monopoly on creativity. In fact, there are several other occupations where job ads, if you look at the job ad content, you might think, this looks like a creative occupation. And one example is those jobs that are as likely as the DCMS list to mention creativity in the job ads. For example, florists, print finishing workers, bakers and chefs. But it's also important that there are occupations that have very similar technical skill requirements to roles in creative occupations. And it turns out these roles include engineering, manufacturing and business development. The existence of these, what you might call hidden creative occupations, perhaps cautions us against policies to develop creativity and related workforce skills that have a narrow sectoral focus. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, that's certainly an impressive approach to looking at skills analysis, cracking some of the challenges we have of consulting with employers. It is very much, as you said, though, Hasan, based on the here and now, because it's based on job adverts that are current. And I'm glad you said also that there needs to be that qualitative, maybe in-depth, maybe even sector-specific view if we're to convert some of that fantastic data into practical interventions or practical policy framing. And so a perfect introduction to Dr. Doris Eikhof, who has been doing work on career destinations and adding that qualitative view in a different type of research. Over to you, Doris.
Thank you. What I wanted to do is to talk a bit about, well, firstly, actually, to name a shift that we've made a bit of implicitly in this conference. And I wanted to make it explicit because I think it's really important. We've talked about creative industries and creative endeavors and creation and exciting things this morning, but we haven't really talked about them as work. And we haven't really talked about them as taking place in employment. And I think when we're talking skills for the creative industries, it's really important to take into view that that's another perspective we are adding and that we have to add. So I want to talk a little bit about how do we get the skills into the creative industries, or looking at the diagram from this morning from Alex, how do we get the voices that do the storytelling? And I really liked the diagram that showed that we had branched out. We started from a situation of multiple voices, and then it kind of got narrowed down to the star architect and the author, and we are actually looking to broaden out again. So what I want to talk about is, what will that broadening out take? And there's two things that are important for me. One thing is that we do need to understand and shape the creative industries as a career destination. And there's a little that's identified a little bit in the industrial strategy already, and I'm really delighted to see that. But I would like to foreground it again. I think we've got a lot of work to do there. The sort of previous to current proposition to young creative minds in particular seem to be, it's interesting. It'll be fulfilling, it'll be fun, it'll be a really good thing to be doing, it'll feel good. Especially in that sort of Bermuda Triangle, I suppose, between recession, economic downturn, university fees, and Weinstein, we do have to make a better attempt at answering questions such as, what will my job look like? What will I earn? How much income security will I have? What skills do I have to acquire? What will I have to invest to get those skills, and what will I get out of it in the end? Not just to young creative minds growing into the industries, but also to their parents and those who will probably finance the skill building. So I think there's a big marketing job there that we have to do, and that also plays into how do we organize our creative industries work and our jobs and our production, our organizations, who are the role models that are visible, how inviting do we look as a career destination? So big piece to do there as far as I'm concerned. And the other thing I'd like to mention concerns the talent pipeline into the creative industry and looking at what I would call the leaks and locks in that talent pipeline. So where does talent drain out of the pipeline, and where does it hit a barrier and can't get through despite us really wanting it to? And drawing on research we've done for the UK screen industries, for the BFI quite lately, but also a couple of other projects, looking at the talent pipeline. What stands out at the moment is the lack of diversity in terms of the skills that come through and can do our collective imagination and storytelling. And when we look at diversity, what we've done so far, again, something that came out really strongly in the work we did for the BFI, is operated what we've called a deficit model of diversity. A model that assumes that people from certain groups, women, BME, certain socioeconomic backgrounds, locations, physical abilities, lack something to participate in the storytelling and the imagination. And then on the back of that assumption, what we do is run empowering initiatives that take the individual and make good whatever we think they lack to participate. Very typical examples would be mentoring initiatives or projects aimed at BAME people, or would be bursaries. Sorry, I know we're going to come to it, for young people from certain economic backgrounds, or the producers program for women. They all have their place. So please, nobody who runs this or has spent lots of time invested in them be offended. They have their place. And I strongly want them to continue, but they also have some limitations. And what we're observing now is that as a community, as a debate, as a conversation between academics and practitioners and policymakers, we're starting to change the conversation to look at the system that we're getting the people in. So it's not so much anymore about helping somebody get over a barrier, but looking at what we do every day in creative work, in creative organization, not so just in selecting people, but how we organize ourselves, who we talk to, and how does that impact the talent pipeline. So making the connect from the here and now to the future, as you were saying, questioning ourselves, not in a sort of, I have a chore that I need to carry out, but in a way to say, okay, what do we need to change in order to fix that talent pipeline and get a creative cast of people who can do the storytelling. So that's the sort of the 2 points that I would like to, based on my research, draw attention to.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think the two presentations so far have really drawn on the power of different types of evidence to shape interventions, to change behaviour, and to shape policy, and it's both types of research that are needed. I think that agenda has moved a hugely long way. But one thing, just pick up on the one point you made, just a point that has always come up as long as I've worked in skills, which is there seems to be, or it's sometimes talked about, an oversupply of interested candidates with some of the skills. So how does that relate to your point about we need to do more on careers and attracting people? Or is it the specific types of people and voices that we need to attract?
There is an oversupply, but that doesn't mean we've got the creative cast that we need for the storytelling. So, and I think it's easy for the creative industries to fool themselves into some sort of complacency by saying we've got enough. Enough doesn't necessarily mean the right.
Right, okay. So your very data-driven analysis coupled with this kind of qualitative analysis is going to be part of the PEC offer, which is fantastic. Chris, I'm going to skip you, Amanda, for a minute. I'm going to break the layout of the chairs here and go to you, Chris, to talk about going back up to look at that whole issue of data and AI and how that affects maybe role definition or how we think about creativity and creative skills. So it'd be great if you could tell us all about that from your research.
Okay, so I lead a centre called Design Informatics, which is an academic research centre, popped out of some research grants and then constituted through a programme really, based on a College of Art, but also working with a School of Computer Science. So really trying to begin to understand the interface between this data-driven innovation panacea, which is going to save us from the end of the world, of course, but also making sure that the way that designers and artists come into this space is a language that they can relate to. So one of the challenges we have is taking a College of Art, Edinburgh College of Art, on a journey into what data might be as a material. Not just as perhaps a space to interrogate and understand social, environmental, economic conditions, but also have a sense of ownership. And there's a real challenge because I think many people in the room, if you're a practitioner, doing is a way of knowing the world. And we don't do through numbers. We do through wood, metal, ceramics, plastic, literature, and knowing that then differently. And there is clearly a step change as we move from creative industries, which perhaps for 100 years have known products as things that I can bring in. If I come for you, if you invite for a meal, you wouldn't want me to bring a data set, you want me to bring a bunch of flowers or a thing.
I would.
And we want the creative industries still to talk about value being constituted in things. Nevertheless, we've got another generation, and my hunch is that you're all late 20th century kids. I don't think many people are under 18 in the room, but we have a whole community that we're leading, teaching, which don't understand the product always instantiated as a thing, a material product. In fact, they understand services, they understand the platform economy, the gig economy, in very complicated ways that educational institutions are trying to teach skills are actually counter to the way that we roll out programs or courses or certificates, because these kids are bolting together different networks. So I think they live with robots, they live with algorithms. They're operating Tinder, they're operating a whole bunch of things in which their colleague is actually an algorithm that's mediating the value proposition. So our challenge, if you like, is to begin to think how, after 100 years of creative industries and sector definition, we've orientated them around products. How do we help a next generation think through what the services are, when actually there's a whole bunch of things which aren't instantiated in a thing. Now, clearly, I do think data is central to that. But of course, if we go to this, we have to do it responsibly. So taking values with us. And I'm going to borrow a phrase from Stephen Coleman, who we work with at Codebase, that creatives are still the best defense against the dark arts. And in that, really, we're meaning the ethics, the values, the thingness of how we relate to each other is critical to the arts, but we have to begin to understand how to play with the hackers and the hustlers who are running away with defining some of the services.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question? Or does that?
Certainly does, and more. I think that's fascinating, and definitely come back to talk about how we might do that and harness that. And I think you're right. You know, some of these binary concepts are very much of a generation of people who struggled with that whole coding, content, tech, creativity sense. And so now maybe we need to be thinking about who are we asking the questions of about the skills that we need to grow our industry, and then how we deliver the interventions, for want of a better word. And talking of which, Amanda Murphy from the Story Futures Academy, I'm calling you this afternoon, I hope that's right, has got the enviable job, I think, she might think unenviable at the moment, of trying to work out what this means in terms of roles, particularly on the skill of storytelling that runs across all our creative industries, but you know, particularly focusing on content and immersive tech. So Amanda, how are you kicking that off?
So we're doing a bit of pilot work. So I'm going to talk specifically about a bit of pilot work we're doing on placements for Story Futures Academy, which, for those who don't know, it's the winning bid of for the Industry Centre of Excellence in Immersive Storytelling. So it's a very different kind of look at the talent pipeline and ways in and kind of how to manage that, because we're sort of dealing with an industry that hasn't necessarily got a lot of joined up research around the skills gaps and the skills need, so working in immersive. So the huge big ambition obviously of Story Futures Academy is quite an enormous sort of challenge to in a way to kind of to improve the uptake really of emergent technologies and to bring in leading storytellers into that from the already kind of existing core screen industries, and for them to explore the potential and kind of share the knowledge and kind of shape the industry in this whole kind of challenge of whether or not it's ever going to be excuse my voice, the number one, the UK is going to be the number one in immersive storytelling. So we've got various work streams within that. So to just contextualise the placement bit, it's part of a much bigger 4 different work streams that involve experimental labs. There's lots of innovative kind of work going on in labs. to kind of, prototype and test new ideas of storytelling. There's the placements, which I'll talk about where we're going with the pilot. Funded co-productions with our creative partners, so the pipeline of production, the increase in productivity is there, and then that's all going to feed back into the sort of development side of the academy, which is much more about sharing the learning, bringing that back in and pumping that into immersive courses and the kind of future training and future kind of pipeline, and creating that pipeline, keeping that pipeline going of talent. So within the pilot work, we're doing a number of things. We're looking specifically at non-fiction to start with, not non-scripted, partly because we talk to our creative partners about what it is, what skills, gaps have they got, what roles is it they're needing to fill. So specifically working with Rewind, one of our creative partners who in Seoul, talked quite wonderfully about some of the Rewind productions. I'm slightly kind of fearing that we're going to now ruin his success by this rather sort of challenging pilot we're doing with him, where we have looked at, what are the gaps that some of our partners have, and there's gaps all the way from creative technologists all the way through to producers and production, sort of right across the board. And one area is definitely kind of in the producer production sort of strand. So Rewind have identified a production, excuse me, and they would like us to embed a placement on, and that's it's a big MR kind of piece set in the real world. And they really need what they call a producer on that production. It's very much starts online, drives the audience to a real world kind of experience in a location. So we started looking at the role of producer. And of course, one of the first challenges and big issues is, even in the TV and film industries, we're bringing people across from the storytellers, world-leading storytellers from the existing industries into immersive. And the role of producer is already, there's huge numbers of iterations of producer. There's everything from, sort of producer, director, and line producer, exec producer, through to edit producers, story producers, social media producers. Huge iterations that are also evolving. And in the immersive sector, it means often something different. So for Rewind, for example, for them, it's actually they draw upon the games industry, and they have inside and outside producers, and there's a whole very different kind of set of skills needed that, in that pipeline between the kind of creative and the curation of a project through to delivery, to the client or the audience, there's a very different kind of set of skills and relationships in play. So then it's much more in the project management area. So we started, looking much more at what are the skill set that actually could deliver that. So just a huge amount of questions around it's the role, it's the definition of role, the language and the grammar used within that industry is very, very different to some of the sort of existing core screen industries. The work methodology, so for example, they talk a lot about, hope Sol doesn't mind me talking more about how Rewind work, but they talk about Scrum methodology and agile kind of work methodology, which is not something necessarily someone from the traditional industry understands. There's lots of use of real-time software. So actually kind of the way a project's delivered end to end for a producer is a very, very different sort of prospect. So we're asking all sorts of questions of, therefore, who do we pull in, who do we talk to, who are these people who are going to come across and upskill into immersive and come and experiment and share that learning. And it's, there's no easy answers to who those people are. This pilot scheme will explore that. It will define quite a lot, or we'll determine what kind of training we're going to give these people in boot camps, how much training that will involve, because they need to immerse in immersive before they can then engage in the job. There's a huge amount of kind of risk management with companies like Rewind who actually have to deliver these productions. So with the person who hasn't quite got the skills and what it takes to get them there before they can share that learning. So that's the kind of level we're exploring. We intend to do this over, right across the sector in a number of roles. So there'll be a good 30 placements from the Academy over 3 years. And I think what we're just trying to do is just to explore, analyse, reflect on kind of how the pilots work, and create roadmaps moving forward that we can then use, in right across in all of the roles. So it's a big challenge.
It's a huge challenge, yeah. And you're researching by doing it.
It's learning by doing.
Yeah. So just on the research side, on how we know what skills we're even talking about, and how we shape those skills, are we asking the right people? the right questions. Going back to, you know, Alex's points this morning that I think probably made us all quite reflective. Are we listening enough to the right people? Hasan, do you think our research currently is getting it right? And if not, where can we plug some of those gaps?
I think one of the problems in research in this area and gathering data in this area is the lack of standardized nomenclature and vocabulary that people use. Obviously, creativity itself is, you know, there was a couple of definitions I think have been offered already by speakers earlier today. It's very, very difficult to have a well-functioning labour market in the economist sense of, you know, clearly articulated supply and demand and matching and efficient matching when people aren't speaking the same language. Now, on one level, that sounds like a very nihilistic, very negative point to make. It's like, so, you know, we're not going to curate everyone using, you know, regulate what languages people use, but there are such things, there are standards. So, for example, I imagine most people here, like me, have got a LinkedIn account. LinkedIn has a skills taxonomy that's available which you can use to sort of communicate to your networks what your skills are. You can use it as an active labour market device to sort of, you know, or resource to sort of look for a job. There are salaries associated with those skills. The problem is that sort of information it's closed. So there's no single source you can go to. There's no open skills. You can't see the hierarchy of skills in LinkedIn skills taxonomy, which makes it very difficult for it to be adopted as standard, unless, of course, LinkedIn takes over the world. And then, of course, read Google, read all of the other various companies, very innovative companies, which are rightly seeing a market opportunity. Our belief is, and certainly my personal belief is, that there's a room for open standards and an open data sort of initiative. A lot of the work we're doing with my sort of Nesta hat on is about sort of trying to standardize language. And for those that are interested, there is what we claim is the first publicly available skills taxonomy for the UK workforce that we built and that we're making available, and the code that underlies it is all open source. So yeah, I think one of the challenges, not the only one, but one of the fundamental challenges, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for trying to create some better order in the labour market, is to standardise in more language.
Yes, and there's sometimes, boy, do I know this one, there's sometimes a resistance to talking about standards in creative occupations or creativity, but I think would people agree with Hasan that that's a crucial first step?
It is, and it's also important to think about who's talking and to whom. So, because it is probably reasonably easy for us in the room to agree some definitions, and maybe we would actually have a good guess at what an MR producer actually is. But then we have to talk to other people in the economy, to educators, and it's not a closed labour market. That's exactly what Hasan's data today shows. We don't have a monopoly on creativity. We certainly don't have a monopoly on management and organisation skills. So there is crossover, and that sort of other side at the moment uses some very traditional, very established ways of articulating skills, of articulating education, of articulating what's happening in the labour market. A lot of that does not fit in the creative industries. Some does. And we need to filter that out and transfer it, because there's no point in reinventing the wheel, but others doesn't. And I loved your example of the EMR producer, whose hand on heart, how many people in the audience could tell a young person they're providing resource or advice for, yes, go for that job or don't. Do we really have an image for that? That's kind of what I mean by career destinations and supporting into that.
Exactly.
The whole point in lots of ways is to push forward. I mean, for this industry to grow, these skills have to change and have to adapt, and we have to create them. You know, in that sector, you know, I think quite a few people producing in that sector will talk about how they kind of 70%, sometimes only 50% know how to make the production, and that actually, you know, the other 30% or 50%, they're kind of making up as they go. So these skills and these roles are evolving so rapidly that whilst you can have informed learning to a certain degree for certain elements and some skills and some roles, we know we have lots of informed learning and kind of, you know, the way you can really use that data. In other ways, we're really, really rapidly kind of changing it.
Yeah, exactly. So, Chris, your answer?
Well, I suppose we're also at a fascinating time when I think the middle part of the generation of the UK is a little bit sussy about who provides the ownership of standards. Right. So I think my parents were very much believers in state. Another generation are really almost moving to decentralised models. They're not sure about state. We're caught We're not sure whether we quite like safe cars, quite like MOTs, we quite like state as a place where it allows us autonomy and agency, but we're also quite curious about these new things bubbling up. So I think the same's happening with data as well, that to some extent we've got to decide if the state wants to control the lens to which what type of data it wants to portray. It will be loaded with baggages based on those that set out the standards and the values.
Yeah.
So who do we let in? Do we let in Facebook and Google? Because in doing so, they bring a whole bunch of new values, which then disrupt our perception of what matters. So I think we're faced with this really interesting moment. I mean, certainly institutionally, the state, as in Edinburgh University, can't own what you're offering. I have to do it with Stephen and Michael at Napier and through my team in creative informatics by not owning the learning journey, by making sure it's shared. But that's Edinburgh letting go, and that's part of state letting go where that space is.
This is fascinating. Hasan?
I think in the area of labour market statistics, it's quite an interesting period, because I think it's fair enough to say in recent years there's been, a big interest in using online job ads data, other sources of online data, to try and build classifications of the workforce. And what we are seeing, just observing, even within UK government, central government, you can see that there's a proliferation of vocabularies being used, but within, I'm talking about sort of within Whitehall government departments, to describe the same phenomenon. And so, so there's a real problem building up. So of course the answer, my own personal view is a publicly backed, publicly incentivized open data framework is the way to go. And actually mine, although this is speculating, my feeling is that under the right circumstances, the major private sector players will participate in that. Because the truth of it is one of the striking observations about the tech economy, the internet platforms, LinkedIn, is that their missions are more complex than traditional corporates, where we talk a lot about purpose-driven organizations, mission organizations. I personally feel that, it's not going to be straightforward to do, but there is an opportunity to create an environment where these players are incentivized to share some data in a way that doesn't cannibalize their own business models, but does recognize that there's a real public value agenda here, which is that we have a labour market which is severely dysfunctioning. And just think about the way the labour market works. Young people's career decisions are made largely on what their parents feel based on their own experiences of the labour market, which are completely different, as you pointed out, to those today. Apart from, it's a severely malfunctioning labour market. And so somewhere the public sector, I think, still has a role to play in addressing that coordination failure.
Yeah, and you can see that played out in phrases such as social license to operate.
Right.
Did Facebook break their social license to operate? Clearly not enough for everyone to delete the app, but VW had a social license to operate where they breached data.
Right.
So understanding entirely
Absolutely.
the constellation in which there's public, private, civic, social, including all parties, begin to author that license to operate seems to be absolutely continuing to play. I mean, if we look at Target, which is the equivalent of manpower in the States, so big recruitment agency, they're working with Airbnb to find out when kids are not in New York are working for jobs, but also want to let out their flats. And that dismantles any concept of ownership, because the kids are sharing flats to get the job done, to move where the work is, that leases out their flat and sublease. So really complicated constellations, but put a civic partner in there, and we get really interesting insights into flow, mobility, empowerment. So I think those constellations, if you like, are where we should aim.
There's a huge ethical dimension to that as well. So career researchers are desperate to get their hands on LinkedIn data, because that would tell us so much about where careers go in the creative industries and how they could be better supported and cared for. But obviously that would mean without the allowance of LinkedIn users scraping that data. So as a researcher, there's a lot of those issues as well. What's the space where we can actually intervene and produce knowledge that's useful for the sector?
So cracking our ability to be creatively standardizing and analyzing and understanding roles to do enough about developing skills and career pathways. Do we know enough about learning and about how to develop those skills? Are we totally focusing on what we can understand about the creative workforce rather than how it's developed? And I think you were beginning to talk about that a bit, Chris, as well.
Well, perhaps in the context of data literacy,
Yep.
it's really tricky, and part of creative informatics' job is to try and organise methodologies toward data literacy, which involves many people who perhaps feel subjugated or users or used, and those who perhaps feel more in control. So I think there's a space in data literacy, but comes with that the data ethics.
Yes, yes.
How we make
Yeah.
steps
Yeah.
to value very, very carefully people's data, shared data, but do it in a way that begins to balance business models toward value models, things that matter. So data literacy with ethics is where we want to
That's where it
focus.
needs to go. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time here, and we scratched the surface. It's only a trailer of skills issues. We need to keep talking about skills, and we will. And we've got fantastic organisations now poised to do just that with the PEC and the Academy and the clusters. So, hey, it's a conversation that will go on. But Peter mentioned this morning this whole endeavour is the nexus between industry and universities. God knows we've got littered initiatives around trying to bring these two worlds together, and I'm responsible for some of that littering, I have to admit. How hopeful do you feel that we are now poised to really crack this university industry engagement around skills?
Harry.
Go for it.
Go first.
Very, genuinely very, because I see a shared language evolving. And to answer the question you had before, within that, we know an awful lot about learning and teaching. When I talk to practitioners, the knowledge that is passed on the job and consciously passed on is immense. So the knowledge is there. And then there's the other side of this sort of trying to codify that knowledge. So I'm very, very hopeful that I now observe, if there is shared languages evolving and people are learning to use them and are describing them and communicating with each other in a way that's understandable to everybody else, we will crack that, yes. Sorry, very optimistic.
I think it's very exciting that there is that shared environment that we've now created. Not only, it's no longer in one sort of disciplinary area. It's actually so interdisciplinary. It's right across the sciences and the arts, which is increasingly important given the sort of focus on STEM subjects in schools to create an industry that has that interdisciplinary sort of approach. So it's very exciting.
And we're certainly moved beyond the universities are about pumping up ready, skilled, trained people. We're way beyond that paradigm, I think. And do you want to have the last word, Hasan?
Just to say, it reminds me of when we produced the Next Gen review. Of course, Kate, we worked together on that review as well, which is looking at the skills needs of the visual effects and video games industries a few years ago now. But I think since then, the landscape has changed a lot. I mean, I would like to think that if we were doing that review now, which was industry-led, there would be a lot larger scale industry educator collaborations. There we were sort of looking for, the recommendations around the Institute of Physics and STEMnet and STEMnet sort of partnering with individuals in the game sector. I think there's more of an appetite now to do large scale collaborations. And of course we've seen that with things like the Next Gen Skills Academy, but there's definitely a shift. Things have changed from even 6 years ago, which I'm sure you'll experience directly yourself.
I see, and I have huge optimism for, and that's in large part because of the people on this panel and in this room who will take forward this agenda. So can we all thank our panellists who've been absolutely brilliant.